Yes, I know. Most of them, those of them who don't know, they can contact me
Okay,
directly.
I'll
So
email them and tell them.
we'll just get everything going in the meantime. What they need to do is they need to put their student numbers on the questionnaire so that I know who to contact.
Okay, and then do I need to use, if I use the mic, the normal mic and that, won't it be a bit loud?
Um,
Generally, I don't need the mic because my voice is small venue and my voice is quite loud, but
you can use that mic. I don't think it's Jesus because I'm gonna listen on my phone, so that I'll
okay,
be able to tell you. But it's actually loud.
okay, great.
See, there is actually a pause button though. So
Okay, great,
anyway,
thanks, I really appreciate it.
okay, so you can just
I'm trying to start the slideshow now.
okay. I'll contact you again.
You let me know how it goes. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, class. Good afternoon. So we are starting. There have been some requests from a couple of students for us to live stream again. So what we're going to do is we're starting live streaming from Tuesday onwards again. So if you want to participate, this means you can watch. If it's a cold, rainy morning on Tuesday, you can watch from your bed or from the lab or wherever you want to watch it. Those of you who have already participated in the first semester, you'll have access. If those of you who didn't participate last semester and maybe you want to watch it from home in this semester, you just need to send me an email and I will email the person in charge, the managers that help me now. Then, can I have an indication as to who actually participated last semester? They just want you to fill this form in. And just the student number one. Did you participate last semester? Who else? Okay, you just need to put the student number on there. Okay, great. Okay. So, anybody else who participated in the live streaming last semester? If you can just hand back the questionnaire to me afterwards. They just want some people who participated. So, before we get to work, okay, before we get to work, I just want to say, so what Mr. Burrows did with you, and even now at the moment, this is part of a research project, it's like a pilot project, but from next year they would like to, the aim is to roll it out across universities for all subjects. And so one of the reasons for this, I'm sure Mr. Burrows explained to you, is not just if you want to stay in bed if it's raining, but also to help students with disabilities or students who have illnesses and can't get to class. And also this is kind of something that they're doing in the rest of the world, in America. So Stellenbosch is a world-class university. We're trying to keep with the trends. Okay, so now we really are known as a very good university. So it's good that you're here. So next week there are no tutorials. There will be a tutorial the week after next again. Today we are discussing gross domestic product. We are finishing chapter 13 today. And so remember at the beginning of chapter 13, we looked at the different macroeconomic goals or the different macroeconomic objectives. And they were, if you remember, or who wants to remind me, what are the 5 macroeconomic goals or the objectives that you have for any country? Anyone quickly? Very good economic growth, and that's what we'll be looking at today. What else? So economische groei is Ian. Full employment, very good. Full employment, does that mean 0 unemployment? Very good. No, because there's always going to be structural and frictional unemployment. Very well done. So we've got full employment, we've got good economic growth, or high economic growth. What are the others? Yes.
Price stability.
Price stability, very good. Price stability or low inflation. Remember, we can't have no inflation, and we definitely do not want deflation. Deflation is not good news for an economy. So you've mentioned 3. 2 more. The one you did homework on recently. Income equality, okay? So equitable distribution of income. We don't want to have the income inequality that we have in South Africa, which is very high. And then finally, the last goal is balance of payments and exchange rate stability, but that you will do with Mrs. Nieuwoud in the fourth term. I do not do international with you. So today we are going to look at economic growth. We're going to discuss what you're actually measuring and how you measure economic growth. And the good news is you've already done the inflation. When you did the calculations for inflation, that was a growth rate for CPI. So you will look at how CPI has changed over time. So you will be doing similar calculations with GDP. Growth rates are always the same. It's always just period 2 minus period 1 divided by period 1 times 100. So now on to GDP. BBP, wat is BBP? BBP is bruto binnelandse produk. En hier is de definitie op hier voor ons. Dat is de totale marktwaarde, of laat ik het eerst meer eenvoudig maken. BBP is de totale productie in de economie. So, totale marktwaarde van alle finale goederen en diensten. En ons praat van goederen en diensten, maar meeste van die tijd sê ons maar net goederen om het te verkort. Maar ons bedoel goederen en diensten. Geproduceer binnen een land se geografische grenzen. Vir 'n sekere tijdsperiode. Baie belangrik, geografische grenzen, ek gaan 'n bietjie meer hieroor gesels. BBP, bruto binnelandse produk. So what is total production in the economy? It is GDP, it's gross domestic product, and I'll explain in a minute what the different letters mean. But basically, very simple, GDP is the total production in the economy. So in your microeconomics, you looked at only maybe the production of this or demand, supply and demand for a particular industry, a particular good. But in this case, you are looking at all the production. So aggregate demand, ons kyk na totale vraag, en totale aanbod. So we're looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply because we're dealing with macro. So this is the definition for GDP, gross domestic product, total market value of all final goods and services. We say it is goods and services. Most of the time we talk about goods. So when we talk about the goods market, we mean goods and services, but we normally just shorten it to goods. Produced, so gross domestic product, we're talking about what is actually being produced. Bruto binnelandse produk, wat geproduceerd wordt in die land, within a country. Okay, so actually there should have been within a country's geographical borders, but within a country that implies geographical borders, and that is what the middle letter is for. The D stands for domestic. So if we see gross domestic product, domestic means within the borders. For a given period of time, normally a year. So if you have a look at this, I just want to illustrate what we mean by GDP. So GDP is everything produced within South African borders, regardless of who's producing it, and it's goods and services. So if you have a cleaning lady from, or a domestic worker from Zimbabwe, that she is cleaning in South Africa, so it's part of South Africa's goods and services, it is part of South Africa's GDP. If you have a French restaurant in Cape Town owned by a Frenchman, that is part of South Africa's GDP. So South Africa's GDP includes everything produced within the borders by South African citizens, by Chinese. We just use Chinese in America as an example here, but we can use anybody. Anybody who is physically in the borders of South Africa and producing a good or service, that is part of South Africa's GDP, regardless of nationality. GDP, gross domestic product. Another national account that you will read about in your textbook, but we're not going to focus much on that, is gross national product. Perhaps we'll look at it in next week's lab session. But gross national product, the only difference is the middle letter. Bruto nasionale product, die enigste verskil is die middle letter, die N en die D. So when you see D, domestic means within the borders. When you see N, national means the citizens or the residents. And then we're not talking about being in South Africa, we're talking about a South African producing anywhere in the world. That's part of gross national product, but back to that at a later stage. So GDP, you need to know, when we measure economic growth, we're measuring the change in GDP, we're measuring the total production. So something important that I forgot to mention, just going back, GDP is the total market value of all final goods. BBP behaalt net finale produkte, finale goederen. Hoekom? Why do we only measure final goods? Because we want to avoid double counting. So, if you get final goods and you get intermediate goods. So let's say a baker uses flour to bake cakes and muffins. In that case, we will only add the cakes he baked to GDP and not the flour, because for the baker, the flour is an intermediate product. So we don't count the flour and the cake, we just count the cake, the final product. However, if you and I buy flour at Pick and Pay or Woolworths, that is counted as part of GDP because that is a final product for us. But anything intermediate is not counted. If it's used in producing something else, then it is an intermediate product and it's not part of GDP. So only final goods, we want to avoid double counting. The other thing important is second-hand goods are not included. So a car is only counted in GDP the year it is produced. If that person sells the car after 2 years, it is not included in GDP because it is not new. It is not newly produced, it's an old thing that's just being resold. So let's look at some of the things that GDP omits. Because there are things that GDP is omitting and that is not being calculated. And so you could argue that GDP is overestimated or underestimated, depending on these different factors. So the first thing that GDP omits is certain non-market goods and services. And here we are talking about, so what is a market? A market is just a buyer and a seller. It can consist of two people. If there's a buyer and a seller and there's a service or a good being sold, then that is a market. So a non-market activity would be, for example, if a cleaner cleans their own house, that is not part of GDP. But if you clean someone else's house and is paid for it, that is part of GDP. If an artist makes a painting and he hangs it in his own living room or lounge, that is not part of GDP. If he sells the painting, we paint it for somebody else and it's sold, that is part of GDP. So non-market activity is the type of thing where you're doing it for yourself, you're not being paid for it, even though you can get paid for it as well. So the moment there's not a buyer and seller, that is not included in GDP. The second thing is underground activities. What do we mean by that? So you get legal and you get illegal underground activities. Who would like to give me an example of a legal underground activity? Wil iemand vir my voorbeeld gee van 'n wettige onaangetekende aktiwiteit? So dis wettig, maar dis onaangeteken. It's legal, but it's not, you don't have to look at your textbook. Think about it yourself. Think about legal activities that are maybe not underground because it's not being recorded. Yes?
Street racing.
Street racing, but is there money involved? Okay, so if there's street racing and somebody's being paid to do that, but actually is that legal? That's illegal, so that's the illegal one. Because the cops get you or they're not going to be happy with you because you're speeding. So that's not legal. Give me a legal example, yes? Buying medicine? Okay, now medicine, it's a bit dicey because I don't know if that's legal. But buying food, if you buy food from a hawker or somebody selling fish or oranges or Hanepoort grapes along the road, normally that's not going to be recorded. Those people are not reporting their sales to SARS. So that's legal. It's legal to sell, but they're just not reporting it. Maybe taxi drivers who don't report. So anytime or when there's a cash transaction, they don't, record it in the bank, but record it anyway. So what I want you to understand there is that in that way, GDP is actually underestimated because there's a lot of underground activities that are happening. And if we added that up, then South Africa's total production would be much more. So that's an example of legal. Illegal would be things like prostitution or selling drugs. And so obviously illegal underground activities are not going to be recorded because when the Statistics South Africa people come and do the survey and they ask, what do you do? Nobody's going to say, well, I sell crack cocaine once a week. Nobody's going to say that. So that again, not recorded, not included in GDP because we don't know. Already mentioned second-hand goods. Second-hand goods are not counted because we want to avoid double counting. We can't count the same car that's being produced, that was produced last year. We can't count it again this year. Yes?
What about Cash Crusaders?
Cash Crusaders, second-hand goods, not counted in GDP. So it's not part of GDP. So why do you say shame? I mean, they're still making their money. But when they sell that good, it's not counted in GDP. Financial transactions, this is one that people struggle with a bit. When we say financial transactions, specifically here we are referring to the buying and selling of shares. Please make sure you sign the register, keep them going around, not keep the register with you. Maak asseblief seker dat jy die register teken, mense. So, the buying and selling of shares is not included in GDP. Would anyone like to mention why? Die verkoop en koop van aandele nie ingesluit by BBP. Hoekom nie? It's a difficult question, yes.
Because they're too volatile, share value changes a lot.
It's a good point, but that's not the reason it's not included in GDP. It's closely related to something else I've already said.
Is it second hand in a way?
Well done, very well done. So when you sell shares, it is when you sell shares, it's not something new being produced. It is simply a transfer of ownership. So if I sell shares to Mark, it's just moving from me to Mark, it's changing ownership, but there's nothing new. What about if I use a broker to buy shares from somebody and I pay the broker commission? Would the broker's commission be included in GDP? Yes or no? What do you think? Some of you are saying yes, some of you are saying no. Why do you say yes? Not because it's a firm, it is yes, but it's because it's a service, a new service that's being produced. So it is something new. The broker is offering a service, and so we are paying him for his service. Remember, GDP includes goods and services, not just goods. Government transfer payments, here we're talking about the child support grant, the old age pension, the foster care grant, the disability grant. These are not included in GDP because it is not production. People receive transfer payments or these grants, they didn't work for it or provide a service or anything. So this is not included in GDP. And then finally, leisure. Would anyone like to, I know you haven't done, or did you do leisure as a good with Mr. Barrows? Did you get to the labor market? So didn't you do the backward bending labor supply curve? Some of you say backward bending labor supply curve.
Maybe he's spoken of the cards.
Oh, very funny. Mark's, well, not funny. Mark saying maybe he's spoken Afrikaans, and so he can't remember. I was going to say something, but I'm being recorded, so I have to be very careful. Also, aside from the live streaming, I don't know if he told you last semester that it also gets archived onto YouTube. So if you want to watch it for revision, you can go and watch it for revision. But so the reason leisure is not included, but first of all, what I was going to ask you is, if you did this with Mr. Barrows, is leisure is also a good. You can buy leisure. And the backward bending labor supply curve was a bit about the higher your income or the wealthier you are, the more leisure you can afford. Someone who's earning a low income can't afford leisure because their salaries, if you're earning R5 an hour, you can't afford to take time off. You have to work all those hours, for example. But so the reason leisure is not included is because it's very difficult to quantify leisure. How do you quantify leisure? And also leisure for one person might not be leisure for another person. So leisure is not included. So this is important to remember, and you'll see it's in your textbook. You need to be aware of what's in GDP and what is not in GDP. So these things, not in GDP. And then GDP is also not adjusted for things like pollution, what we call the bads generated in the production of goods. Unfortunately, the reality is, when we produce goods, there are also not side effects, but there are bad things being generated, like pollution, for example. And those are known as negative externalities. We'll be doing more about that in chapter 15. The point, though, is that if we took into account the negative externalities, it doesn't have to be pollution, it can be noise, for example. So just as an example, okay, you aren't on the side of campus, but my office is right next door. And currently they are fixing the Van der Ster building. And so that construction is part of GDP because it's a service and it's part of South Africa's GDP, but at the same time, there's a lot of noise. Not a lot, but that noise affects me as well. So what I want you to understand is, if we were to try to adjust GDP, taking into account negative externalities, which I'll explain in chapter 15, then GDP should actually be a bit less. Now we're seeing a term that you've already seen before. You saw not the GDP part, but the nominal versus real part. And we saw this when we did inflation. Who would like to remind the class the difference between nominal and real? Again, make sure you sign the register. I need to know who's here. Verskil tussen nominale en reële asseblief. You did when we did inflation. What's the difference between a nominal value and a real value? Or what's the difference between your nominal salary and your real salary?
Face value and purchasing power.
Okay, very good. So you said face value and purchasing power. So nominal value is like your face value. It's what it currently is. The real value is the nominal value divided by CPI. So the real value, it's the face value divided by or adjusted by inflation. So there's two things you need to know. When Statistics South Africa and the Reserve Bank or the statistical authorities collect information on GDP, they are actually collecting nominal GDP information. Nominal GDP is measured in current prices. So remember that term current? Current prices, it's self-explanatory. Current prices means the prices you're seeing in shops right now. So current prices for 2015 is what you see in the shops. Current price for 2014 would have been the prices in shops last year. Nominal GDP is simply measured in current prices. So remember this. It could be a type of question I could ask, nominal and current associated together. So the question then is, and we'll get to why we're measuring real GDP, the question is, can nominal GDP tell us whether there was an increase in production from one year to the next? Let's see, I'm going to show you an example. The answer is no, and I'll explain why now. So the problem is that when you measure increases in nominal GDP, or if you look at total production increasing in nominal terms, what you are seeing is a rise in production, yes, but you're also seeing a rise in prices. So you don't know whether that figure is completely price-driven, whether it's a combination, etc. And so we need to convert it to real GDP to see if there's economic growth. Let me show you an example. So getting back to real GDP and nominal GDP, so real GDP is simply CPI inflation adjusted nominal GDP. That sounds like a mouthful, but it's simply nominal GDP divided by CPI times 100. So the other important term you'll see in blue on the board, constant prices. Real GDP is measured in constant prices. So where have you seen this constant prices before? Which year would be the constant prices? Anyone like to try? I heard somebody say base year. So often the base year would be the constant prices. So if I want to measure real GDP for 2014. Then I would take the total production of 2014 and multiply it by the base year prices. Not the current prices, not the prices for 2014, but the base year prices. So the base year price would be the constant price. And that's important because if you compare nominal GDP from year to year, in a sense, you don't know what you're comparing. Was there an increase in economic growth or not? That is why we had to take prices out so that we can get real GDP where prices are staying the same and we only see growth in total production. So this is what I want to show you. So this is a table from the Reserve Bank, and it is for nominal GDP in South Africa. It's a few years back, but I simply want to illustrate something to you. These slides are on Sunlearn. If you want to print it or put it on your computer, it is on Sunlearn. So the first thing I want you to notice is the word current prices. So what does current prices mean? Current prices, heersende pryse, dis die huidige pryse. So, as ons praat van heersende pryse, vir 2005 beteken dit is die totale produksie of al die produkte vermenigvuldig met 2005 se pryse. As ons praat van BBP in 2008 teen heersende pryse, dan is dit die totale produksie in 2008 vermenigvuldig met 2008 se pryse. So by current prices, it's that year's total production multiplied by that year's prices. So 2009 GDP at current prices would be 2009's total production multiplied by 2009's prices. And the same applies for other years. 2011's GDP at current prices would be all the products produced that year multiplied by 2011's prices. Very important to know the difference between current prices and constant prices. So what I want you to look at is at the bottom, you see that nominal GDP increased from 2011 to 2012. So there was an increase in GDP at current prices. Nominal always measured in current prices, real always at constant prices. So note the increase, about 2.9 to 3.1 nominal GDP. So the question though is, when you look at a nominal value is, can we say, does this mean that the country produced more goods and services? It could mean that, it might not. Let's see. First of all, there you see constant 2005 prices. So in this case, you could say 2005 was the base year, the reference year. And so what this means when you see constant prices, it means that for all these years, they took the production in that year, but they multiplied it by 2005 prices for every year. And this is more comparable. You can use this for economic growth because now the effect of prices has been taken out. So let's look at what happened. So you see that real GDP also increased, but also note that the real GDP is a lot less than the nominal GDP. The nominal GDP had a 2 and a 3 in front of it. This starts with a 1. So you can see when we take inflation out, the value is actually smaller. But they both increased. But let's see what happened in 2008 to 2009. Remember 2008, 2009, we had the recession. So in a recession, we know the economy is going to shrink. We know GDP is going to go down, or it has gone down. So first of all, there's current prices. Note the increase in nominal GDP from 2008 to 2009, to 2.2 to 2.4, and these are in millions. These are really big amounts. So there was an increase in nominal GDP. But look what happened to real GDP. Real GDP dropped. So what this tells you is, I'm going to go back quickly. This increase you see from 2008 to 2009, circled in red, that was entirely because of an increase in prices. It wasn't that production went up that much, it was that prices went up. And we are interested in economic growth, so we must adjust, we must convert nominal to real. See what happened? It went down. So GDP contracted, there was negative economic growth. So if you calculate economic growth from 2008 to 2009, you will get a negative value. But what I'm showing you here is why you must calculate economic growth in real GDP and why we're interested in real values, not nominal values. And have a look on top, constant prices. Constant 2005 prices, the base year was 2005. How do we calculate it? So remember, this is something similar. It's new, it's a new thing on top, but it's similar to something you've seen before. When you had to convert your nominal salary to your real salary, what did we do? Say you earn 20,000 a month. We said 20,000 divided by CPI in that period, multiplied by CPI in the base period, which is always 100. So it was 20,000 divided by CPI times 100. Exactly the same for real GDP. So if I give you a nominal value and I ask you to calculate economic growth, you first have to convert it to real GDP. If you tell me, if you just look at nominal GDP year 2 minus nominal GDP year 1, then that is not economic growth you're counting, you're also counting prices. So this is the formula, similar to what you've seen before. So don't get too nervous. It's simply the nominal value divided by CPI times 100. So what you see at the bottom there, it just looks complicated because it looks like two formulas, but the one is just Afrikaans and the one is English. So what you see over there is a growth rate. Where have you seen something similar? With inflation. Inflation was simply the growth rate for CPI. So remember with inflation, you saw CPI 2 minus CPI 1 divided by CPI 1 times 100. Now we're looking at economic growth. So now we want to see what's happening to the growth in real GDP. So instead of where we use CPI for inflation, you now use GDP, real GDP, period 2 minus period 1 divided by period 1 times 100. You are going to get some practice with that. But the growth rate, it's the same thing. It's just period 2 minus period 1 divided by period 1. So for those of you who could calculate inflation, those of you who could convert a nominal value to a real value, it's the same thing here, it's just different terms. So here's a little exercise. What's the first thing? Who wants to tell me what the first thing is that you're going to do here? If someone will put up their hand, I'll bring a prize on Tuesday. A small prize. Times are hard. Somebody, yeah, you want to do something? They say something? The question is, what is the first thing you're going to do here when you answer this question? Your first step. Yes. Convert what to real GDP? Very good. So the first thing you're going to do is convert GDP to real GDP. So you're going to take 1 million divided by CPI times 100. Although you're still going to get 1 million. So what can you tell me about 1998? What's special about 1998? How do you know it's the base year? Very good. So there you've learned so much already. So you can identify that the base year is 1998 because CPI is 100. We know that in the base year, the nominal and real values are always the same because you're dividing by 100 multiplied by 100. So the first thing you're going to do here is convert nominal to real. And then what you do is you use this formula on the previous page. So do I have any questions at this point? Questions? Any questions? No? Yes?
Will those GDP values always be nominal values? Like
if it just says GDP, then it's nominal. If it's real GDP, we will tell you real GDP. But a good question as well that I want to mention is, I said economic growth. You cannot calculate economic growth with a nominal value because that is not economic growth. That's the growth in prices and economic growth. Economic growth is simply the change in real GDP from one period to another. So if, for example, let me just go show you quickly. Hopefully the internet does not let me down. I just want to show you to Stats SA. Oh, but I forgot my, I don't think my iNet key is open. Okay, not sure why this is telling me the page can't open. Okay, so remember I said you can see key indicators by flashing across the screen. So the latest GDP figure they had here on top is Q1, 1.3% quarter to quarter. So who can remember what the difference between year on year and month and quarter means? So this value over here, how do they calculate this? So again, maybe a prize. Who can remember or tell the class, how did they calculate that value? Given what you've learned today, and also the quarter on quarter, year on year, month on month you learned with inflation. Wil iemand probeer? Hoe hulle dit bereken? Just give me the formula. I mean, I don't need amounts. Obviously, you don't know what the amounts. Okay, so it's quarter on quarter for the first quarter. So what they did was they said Q1 of 2015 minus Q4 of 2014 divided by Q4 2015's real GDP times 100. That is how they got this figure. Okay. And if you want to see more, I just want to understand where you got it. You will be given more calculations. Okay, so what I want you to do for homework, I think we'll stop there. This is on Sunlearn. I want you to do this calculation for homework. You will hand it in on Tuesday morning. It will serve as roll call, but this is all you need to know for now for real GDP. We will start with chapter 14, and I'll show you more.